Good evening, morning, middle of the night, or time zone where you are. It's Friday. That means it's time for All Thing Considered. My name's Lauren Crow. I am Steer of the Troth. With me is my comms director, fearless, important person here,
Hi,
Ben
everybody.
Kowalski-Grahek.
Ben Kowalski-Grahek, Director of Communications for the Troth. And we're actually both happy to have us with us here, Dr. Scotty Snook.
Yes, so excited. So let's roll that intro and we'll be right back. I don't know about you, Ben, but it's been a great week.
It's been a big week.
Especially for pagans and heathens, it's been a great week.
Mm-hmm. It has. Just this week, you were on Court TV. I think we have a clip of that you wanted to play.
Yeah. So we're going to play a clip here in just a minute. What I kind of intro that. So I got invited to be on Court TV to speak about the differences between heathenry, Odinism, and Ásatrú as it in regard to the Delphi murder trial that is happening, where the defense is the Odinites did it. And I'm hoping sometime after the first of the year, we're going to be able to have Anya and Kevin on from the Murder Sheet, who are a podcast that's local to this, on with us on All Things Considered to discuss the case and talk about this defense and this Frank's motion and kind of dissect why this is a huge problem for heathens and it could cause potential problems down the road. But it was really exciting.
And it is important because some people might be asking, well, why is our organization and the president of the organization weighing in on a local murder case? As you might have seen from our website, the updated articles there, that there is an angle in there, as Lauren's going to show in the clip, of a term also used to describe our religion, Odinism, being brought into the conversation as to a possible motive for the murder of these two young girls in this murder case in Delphi, Indiana. It is important for people like Lauren, for organizations like the Troth, to come out in front of these stories, because while they are a niche interest for some groups, like these true crime groups or Court TV, these kinds of accusations, these kinds of motions that get filed can have serious consequences if they start to catch fire. Lauren, you being a child of the Satanic Panic, know full well how stories can catch fire very quick, and if people are not out there in front of them, like with who have organizational backing, like you, to offer some kind of pushback to it, they can catch fire very quickly.
And I think another thing is that this particular case is not just a niche thing, right? These were two very beautiful, young, I mean, when I say young, I think they were 13, 14 years old little girls who were violently and brutally murdered. And this case has caught international attention. I got contacted by heathens in Australia and in South Africa, heathens, who were hearing about this and being like, they were scared where they are, because this news wasn't just making the news in the US. It wasn't just making the news in Indiana. This was making nationwide news, and people who aren't true crime nerds were hearing about it and we're talking about it. And I've also been, another big platform actually has me as a registered expert. So I'm able to go in and answer questions, and with the backing of this large true crime website, and they're saying, this person is who she says she is. She's an expert, and also kind of try to dispel these myths. So I'm going to go ahead and play this 3-minute clip from Court TV, from my appearance, where I explained to their primetime host, as I'm part of like a wall of people, I felt like I was in the Brady Bunch, what's going on. So I'm going to play this real quick.
Practice heathenry. Is there a difference? Are these things connected? What, from your perspective, what is an Odinist, and who are these people that we're talking about that are doing what they're alleged to be doing by the defense?
I think the easiest way to explain it is Odinism is a prison gang. It is a gang that disguises itself as a religion. Odinism, specifically in prisons, started by a woman named Elsa Christensen in the early 1980s in Florida. And their sole purpose for gathering as a religion was so that they could have cover to then talk about white supremacist political activity and other activity with impunity. So Odinism is, think of it as Odinism, if you think about it, it's the Westboro Baptist Church of Germanic and Norse paganism, which all of the things we're talking about right now fall under kind of this umbrella of Germanic and Norse paganism. Germanic in the sense of Germanic languages. So you think of Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, Aramaic, all of these tribes that existed pre-Christianity in Northern Europe. So then you have Ásatrú. Ásatrú and Odinism are not the same thing. Ásatrú in the United States, I'm speaking specifically in the United States because it is different in Europe, is a racist but not white supremacist gang racist form of paganism. So they believe that to be a Norse pagan, that should be allowed to people with Norse descent, so white people essentially. You have to be white enough. And then you have heathenry. So heathenry is a blanket term. I practice what's called inclusive heathenry, and we believe anyone can be heathen. As we say, we're not so arrogant to think we know who the gods are going to call, right? We're not going to try to tell our gods what to do. And so the problem that I'm seeing in here is, first of all, Odinite is not a thing. I don't know where they come up with this. It's a mineral. It's found in like sedimentary areas. I have a geology background, so the first time I read that, I was very confused as to why they were talking about rocks. But also, I think one important thing is to remember is that Odinism is present anywhere that there's racism because it's not a religion. It's a gang that is in prisons using the guise of religion to be able to gather and do gang activity.
Gotcha. I mean,
so yeah.
There we are. No, and thank you for doing that, Lauren. That was a important appearance. It was important, and you did have a little bit of back and forth as well. The larger clip is on Court TV. You can find it on YouTube. What's the title of the video on YouTube?
I believe they changed the name, but I'll tell you what, I will put it in the description of I will put it in the description of this video with the timestamp so it jumps ahead to where I am, because it's an hour-long video on Court TV, and I'm like, I think 38 minutes in. It was interesting also seeing how the sausage was made. I've never actually done a remote video thing like that on TV before. I've done remote TV appearances, but you always have to I always had to go into the studio and do them. So back when I worked in TV, some of you guys don't know, I was actually a journalist and did broadcasting for years. So this was like a brand new thing for me. It was great, but it was really cool. And I just want to say on here, thank you especially to Kevin and Anya, and also to Trish at Web Sleuths for all of the hard promotion you guys did to let us use our voices to speak about heathenry. Because they can say all the things they want, but and Anya and Kevin especially have done a tremendous job on Court TV over the past months trying to defend us, inclusive heathens. And they're not heathen, they're Catholic. But I'm just very grateful for them. And they were so supportive of me. They were texting me beforehand, and I called them and they were trying to let me know how it works and what to be prepared for. So I'm very lucky that we just seem to have a really great community around people who are trying to get the truth out about things. And like I said, I'm very blessed to have had that support from them. So I'm very grateful. You can also, they have a podcast called The Murder Sheet, and Joe Hundig, who is our director of InReach, which is our prison services, and I did a very long, hour-and-a-half interview with them as well. So you can also go listen to that. It was a really great experience with them talking about Odinism in prisons and the origin of Odinism. I got to nerd out on my history and talk a lot about Elsa Christensen. So you guys know that that's kind of, that's kind of what I do, is I nerd out on history. So
yeah, we actually, and that's actually a very good segue into the topic tonight, because last time we actually did have a historian, an archaeologist.
Well, we have one more. We do have
one more announcement.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just say that, just because I know that I'm going to let that segue just slip away. Just going to let it go.
Yes, just like that. So this week was also the International Pagan Day of Prayer and Action for Peace. Last night, if you were on the streaming, we did a service for prayer and discussion about how peace relates to heathenry, and that will also seg into our discussion today, because there is that myth that heathenry is not a peaceful religion.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was wonderful. I do want to thank the Aquarian Tabernacle Church, who joined us in this, as well as our German counterparts. Ben, help me here. My brain just went.
Eldering, and it's VFDH, which, correct me, it's Vereinheit für Deutsches Heidentum, which is the Union of German Heathenry.
Yes.
I think I did that right.
Yeah.
I am so sorry, Heimo, if I got any of that right. But Eldering and Vereinheit für Deutsches Heidentum.
And so I'm really excited about that, because that is going to be a really exciting opportunity to, they joined in, and the feedback we've gotten, we're going to do it again next year. So I'm really excited. Yep. So we do have a couple of announcements coming up. First of all, Winter Trothmoot is our virtual Trothmoot that's going to be coming up the 12th through the 14th of January. It's only $25, and that $25 the cost of Trothmoot, as well as it will help us make sure that we can provide scholarships for people that are in, because we rotate time zones. And so what we do is we provide scholarships for people who live in states where we won't have Trothmoot due to their policies on women or queer people. And so we offer scholarships to people to help come to Trothmoot if they live in those states. So you can go check that out on our website. Also, Frith Forge is going to be the 13th through the 16th of April. And I don't know about you, but I'm going to Costa Rica for that. So that's going to be super exciting. That's at Hotel del Bosque in Costa Rica. And that is associated by, sponsored, of course, by the Troth and the association Ásatrú Yggdrasil. So very excited to have all of these people from Heathen and Ásatrú organizations from around the world will be there. So really excited. We've got some really cool things planned. I know Ben and I have been working on. So, and then the last thing is we're excited to announce that we have our save the dates for Trothmoot 2024. It's going to be in Althing, California at George, which is the Sons of Norse Camp. And that is going to be the 13th through the 16th of June. So really excited. It was kind of hard to find a place this year on the West Coast because of all the fires. I believe like half of the campgrounds have burned down out there. And then the place we normally go to near Seattle is completely closed down. So, it was a wild time trying to find somewhere, but that registration will be up for that in a couple of months. But we do have the date and the location. So save your pennies, save your PTO. It's going to be an awesome time as we celebrate our Aduna editor and her 100 issues of Aduna that she has edited, Diana Paxson. So that's just unreal. Sorry, 100 issues is just unreal.
All right, and with that, just wanted to segue into our topic for the evening. Into our topic for the evening, which is just to compare and contrast. So last time, on our last episode, we were talking about the history of the myths that that are out there, but like the most popular myth in Norse paganism, the one about the sudden and violent conversion to Christianity. That was an article that we had published actually a while ago, Lauren, if you remember. We got quite a bit of pushback to that article and a lot of anger about that particular article. But then we actually had Professor Harold Williams come on. Dr. Williams then went through the actual history of the conversion period, but it doesn't quite, and how this myth of the violent conversion got started within archaeology, actually. So that doesn't quite complete the picture, though. What we need to complete this picture is how these stories manifest in our community, in our groups. And for that, you don't need a historian, you need a sociologist. And fortunately, we actually know a very good one, and one who has actually studied American heathenism or heathenry, and that would be Dr. Snook.
All right. Yeah, and it's really excited. I remember when you were finishing up your book, and I have known Scotty for years, but remembering when you were finishing up your book and publishing it, and how exciting it was to have a book that was actually a study of our faith, right? That was an actual academic study, because before that, I feel like we were giving our best guesses, but they weren't always great. And your book really disproved a lot of ideas in the community.
Did it?
For instance, I think a lot of people thought that our community only existed politically on the margins, right?
Mm.
Everyone was far right or far left.
Mm-hmm.
And your work really proved that we are really a reflect. It's one of the things I quote this constantly from your work, is that to some degree, heathens in America, at least, are definitely a reflection of the society as a whole.
Yeah, that's actually the quote that sticks with me as well. Yes.
Yeah. And so oftentimes, as I watch society twist and turn, I think, how is this also reflecting back into our community?
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, I will tell you. So,
yes.
Yeah. So tonight you wanted to think about sort of contemporary heathen myths or community-driven stories about where we come from and who we are. So last week, like you said, the guests had a great talk about the history around the conversion of ancient heathens to Christianity. And the idea was to contextualize, correct, and add nuance to the story that, heathens were all violently converted by foreign Christian invaders by the sword. And that was a really cool show. I learned a lot. Mostly when I listen to history, I realize how little I actually know and how much of what I think I know is wrong. So that brings us to today, moving from the historical accounting of what actually happened to the persistence of that myth of violent conversion in today's heathen communities. And I can only really speak for what goes on among American heathens. We might call these stories that we're talking about victimhood narratives, as they position contemporary heathens as the descendants of an ancient people who were done wrong by Christians. Now, victimhood narratives are something I've actually thought a lot about, though never as a distinct research concept. I've taught about it in my sociology classes. We talk about it in my sociology religion class, in my course on American paganisms, and most recently, a lot in my upper division Christian nationalism seminar. And it strikes me that victimhood narratives are such a core piece to the construction of a peoplehood for so many groups, whether they were actually victimized or not. For some groups, their actual victimization continues to this day. And so those narratives are not imaginative, and they are narratives of resilience rather than victimhood. So it's important, that we don't diminish the stories of historically oppressed people. Where victimhood narratives become more interesting to me is when they're largely based on a historical imagination or a strategic tactic of collective identity building and legitimation. So scholars actually make a distinction between collective victimization and collective victimhood. Mm-hmm. So victimization is like the actual occurrence and act of violence against a group, where victimhood is kind of the subjective experience and construction of this harm doing. Collective victimization involves collective violence against a group based on a characteristic, but also includes structural violence where material resources are monopolized by a group or class and channeled away. Collective victimhood, which is what we're talking about here, often involves a dominant discourse or kind of a master narrative about the in-group's victimization, like a therapeutic victimhood that appropriates victim status to give someone more credibility. Many groups have been victimized in the past and are marginalized in the present. When groups who are otherwise part of the majority, that is, groups who hold the majority of the political, economic, and social resources, status, power, prestige, or even simply the normalcy of default status, like being white, male, or Christian in the United States, those groups often engage in victimhood narratives as a component of legitimation and collective identity. So right-wing Christians, for example, have created entire social trends and movements around their victimhood narratives, from like the war on Christmas to the danger of taking prayer out of schools to religious freedom claims, and now recycled, right? Now the claims that their kids are being indoctrinated or groomed, right? White supremacists have done this for decades, repeating variations of the Great Replacement narrative, claiming reversed racism, always suggesting that someone is doing them harm, taking something from them, keeping them from their entitlements, right? And this forms a core of their collective identity and is actually a political tool because it mobilizes them and it provides them the emotional foundation for their movements. And pagans aren't special in that regard. Grand narratives provide the foundation for collective identity. Where did we come from? How did we get here? Why are we doing this? How are we different from them? Like whoever they are that we're contrasting ourselves with. Modern paganisms have always had a narrative of having been victimized, whether it's the story of the burning times that inspired early goddess worshippers and Wiccans, or the story of a violent forced conversion by the sword that inspires many contemporary heathens and druids. These stories are popular, and so they must have a function, right? Bring in the sociologist.
Yes.
In modern pagan movements, oh, sorry, Ben, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I was going to say, like, and yes, bring the sociologist. So what is the function? What is it that these stories, that was actually going to be our first question.
Well,
like,
great question.
Yeah. Well, like, what purpose do these stories serve for us as pagans? Little hurt you said we weren't special, but I don't totally understand what that
I would say, having grown up fundamentalist Christian, like I grew up being told that, any day now we were all going to go to jail for being Christians.
Yeah.
The TikTok trend where people are like posing for their mug shots for being a Christian cracks me up.
I mean, all of the religious freedom, legislation is built on this idea that, Christians somehow are having their religious freedom threatened, when it's really just religious power, right? Like hegemony that they're looking for. So to answer your question, in modern pagan movements, these stories we could call colonization narratives, right? They're legitimating narratives, a way to be part of a marginalized group populated overwhelmingly by white people, and tap into the story of historical marginalization and violent oppression as a way to claim some kind of authentic, historically embedded badass resilience. We tend to view victims of colonization and violent oppression as having the moral high ground. And victimhood is a common trope in American culture that tends to elevate the moral status of the people suffering it and gives them a sort of sacred credibility and moral purity. So these particular
doesn't it always give them a spiritual? Doesn't it also give them a? Don't we also see them as having a more spiritual person?
Well, yeah. I mean, whenever we
the concept of the indigenous people or the magical black person. I won't use the term they use, but in literature, but there's definitely that concept of these people are oppressed, so they must be more ascended.
That the suffering conveys moral, some kind of moral boon to someone.
Yeah.
Well, not even that, spiritual power. Like they are more ascended. Yeah. They are more ascended. They are more enlightened.
Yeah, it's this moral purity that is sacralized, right? That's part of this sort of sacred narrative, right? These particular stories of religious oppression binds pagans together with a common historical past, like a common experience, even though it's like a collective memory, like we made up, right? So we also see strains of these stories throughout literature and film as well, a sort of reversed colonization narrative that switches the roles of perpetrator and victim. In one book called a book on reverse colonization in sci-fi and fantasies, which many of us are into, David Higgins outlines a sort of alt victimhood, is what he calls it, and reminds us that imagining oneself as a colonized victim often serves as the ideological core of imperial fantasy. And I would extend that to our own heathen historical origin narrative for those of us who benefit the most from modern day conditions of empire. So he argues that in a cultural milieu where colonizers are now usually imagined as villains, anti-colonial insurgents and resistance figures are nearly universal heroes. And we like to imagine early heathens fighting against the forced conversion and colonizing systems of domination by Charlemagne, the Romans, and their parallels. Higgins uses the term imperial masochism to describe the way subjects who enjoy the advantage of empire adopt the fantasy role of colonized victims to kind of fortify and expand their agency. And he actually echoes a lot of what other scholars say when he says it's less about real pain and more about enjoying the presumed moral superiority that fantasies of victimization enable. So under these conditions, privilege is sustained through the appropriation of victimhood. And all of this contributes to the projects of collective identity and legitimation. It's one of the most powerful foundations of contemporary conservative movements. And many of you might remember my buddy Thad Horrell wrote about this early on and received a lot of flack for it in his piece on heathenry as a post-colonial discourse, where he really took heathens to task for this historical victimhood narrative. And he argues, and I'll quote his work here, rather than promoting a sense of solidarity with colonized populations, heathen critiques of colonialism and imperialism often serve to justify disregard for claims of oppression by colonized minorities. After all, if we've all been colonized, what is there to complain about?
Yes, it's ringing. It's the thing that rings really. That's going to probably ring to a lot of people. It's what this sounds a lot like is the one that many of us have heard, which is, well, the Irish were slaves too.
That was coming up next.
It's the exact, it's that exact same kind of thing where it's not meant to. It's not meant as a way of declaring solidarity.
Yep.
It's meant as a way of dismissing the claims of someone saying, well, look, my people were enslaved. They were brought here against their will. The Irish were slaves. It's more like what's wrong with you? The Irish are fine.
Yeah, it absolutely. It supports an erasure of the consequences of modern racial categories. And I mean, after all, whiteness itself is a product of the colonization and enslavement of people of color around the world. So in effect, a claim to be a victim of this same system is an attempt, like you say, to ignore, discount, and deny realities and privileges of whiteness in the modern world, even if white folks' ancient ancestors were culturally kind of colonized in some cases. It doesn't really impact the fact that we are beneficiaries of the system that European expansionism put into place. And so you're right. In many ways, this is another version of the European immigrant myth, the story that, my ancestors came to the United States with nothing, worked really hard, were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, afford their descendants, a comfortable life. This, like you said, my Irish ancestors were enslaved too story. It's part of this narrative. And what this does is it responds quite directly to people of color pointing out structural racism in which their experiences with the legacy of slavery and forced immigration are situated. And, people don't read American history, so many of them probably don't know that a lot of the policies that gave European immigrants a leg up to begin with were based on racial access. A lot of Black and Latinx workers were pushed into low-paying jobs that were not included in government policies that protected wages. They were locked out of unions. They were denied loans and mortgages, denied entry to universities, couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill. You know, all this by way of saying that this entire narrative around resilience in the face of, you know, colonization or victimization is a way of trying to give credibility to heathenry via a historically embedded, marginalized peoplehood without any of the consequences of colonization, alongside a sense of sort of sacralized, badass moral superiority.
And I think one other thing to put in here is the time period in which heathenry really started up again. The last, you know, when we dismiss kind of the earlier startups, you're coming in at that time period of right past the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
So it is a time of upheaval, change. And people, if I've learned anything from right now, where we are in kind of a similar time of upheaval and change, is that people are very desperately looking for some sort of identity. They are looking for some way to understand the new reality of the world. And these myths can do that in the same way that, for me, growing up in a, independent fundamentalist Baptist church, you were trying to hold on to this collective identity because it kept people in the church, or it gave them this identity of, well, if you're here and you're part of this, then you're special because you're one of God's chosen people. And, if the police or whoever come after you, that's because you're special. Everyone wants to feel special. They want to feel like they matter. And, to put it in the way that the kids would say, people don't want to feel like they're an NPC.
Yeah. The kids do say that. Yeah. And I think about it in terms of like frontlash and backlash movements. And that's, another theorist, Jeffrey Alexander, talks about sort of every time social movements have sort of a progressive frontlash, we can think of the civil rights triumphs as an example, that there's a backlash attempting to put things back to where they were. And so when we had the civil rights triumphs, right, and like people of color were like, hey, I'm a person and I'm an equal citizen and I deserve to, live a life. White people were like, dear God, right? These people are like, they have roots and historical narratives that are like giving them the moral high ground, and like, maybe we're the bad guys, and do we have roots, and who am I? And, right around the same time that like ethnicity, in terms of all of these manufactured categories, but these sort of nationalities, like, oh, I'm German, or I'm Irish, or I'm Polish, or whatever, those didn't seem to divide white people anymore, right? And so then we have these sort of third generation patterns of white folks being like, well, what are my roots? So there's a whole realm of sociological literature on white folks tapping into, what some scholars have called symbolic ethnicity, to try and figure out like who they are, not in the sense that like we're in an identity crisis, but in a sense of like rootedness and belonging, like an actual like peoplehood with continuity, right? Particularly in this country, because we don't really have these sort of ancient roots in the soil.
Yeah, and you also have this in the 60s and 70s, in that time of the civil rights movement. You have this understanding of, I think it's like any time where normalcy is challenged, where the definition of normal gets challenged, to the people who get to occupy that space of normal, other people coming into that space or getting to be in that space feels like they're losing something, right? Like when it's something you often hear with Christian nationalists, that they're taking this from us. They're taking this from us. When in actuality, or I think there was a couple interviews where they're asking people, what is it that gay marriage takes away from straight marriage? And they can't quite define it, right? They can't quite. They feel that way. You can tell that they feel that way, but they can't quite pluck out of the air what it is exactly that's being taken. And what it is the assumption that only straight people can get married. It's the assumption that this is the normal and the normal thing that people do. Once that's taken, it feels like something has been removed.
Well, I would argue beyond just an assumption like that, out of the realm of just sort of like a psychological gift. I would say that it's a position of power and sort of hegemony of domination, right? Like this, you're at the top of the political, social, economic hierarchy, and all of a sudden you feel as though you're being pushed off that hill by other people trying to claim a piece. And so you've got to claw it back. Michael Kimmel writes a lot of stuff about masculinity. He's another sociologist, and his idea, he called it aggrieved entitlement, right? To explain sort of the victimhood narratives that are so deeply embedded in like contemporary masculinity and men's movements, right? This sort of feeling that it's your birthright to be in positions of power and domination and control, particularly if you're white, not just over women, but also other like racialized others. And so, we know what Make America Great Again means, right? Reagan used that same exact phrase. It's a callback. And what it means is putting Black folks and women like back in the margins where they belong, and, kind of a return to that, again, that white cultural hegemony. So yeah, what we're seeing today is that same exact thing, just differently flavored. So yeah.
And it's interesting you use the thing about I was just thinking like it's almost like, I don't know, when you're on it's almost like you're on a hill and you don't realize you're on a hill until people start coming up and be like, okay, I finally made it up this hill. Like, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean I'm on a hill? And you start realizing like, wait a minute, I've this idea of this privilege that I've had my whole life, I've just become so accustomed to being on this hill that I didn't even realize it was one, right? That's
the whole nature of privilege, right? Is that it's invisible to the bearer.
Yes. Yeah, which is why you end up with, I don't know, you probably know more about this. You definitely know more about this than I do, which is that this is probably why you end up with so many people being confused about why they're upset. Why am I so angry? It didn't used to be like this. Well, you didn't realize that you were on a hill this whole time. That's what happened.
I used to be able to go anywhere and do anything and say anything to anyone about anything, and nobody could do anything about it. And now they tell me I'm an asshole and I'm mad.
Yes, because they were too afraid before to say something, and now they can. Absolutely.
And I think one thing is very interesting with this is that because a lot of times we're in these times of social upheaval, where people, especially young people, feel rootless and they feel like they don't have this long narrative. I know in my experience where I am locally, and I can't speak, I can only speak to what I've experienced. This is where these racist groups will come in and recruit on these people and tell them the reason you feel this way, the reason you can't find a job or this, the other is because of whatever the boogeyman of the day is, because it changes. When I was young, when I was younger, it was you couldn't because of, directly after 9/11, it was, people who were with Muslims, and then it's immigrants from South America and Central America, and then it's an ever-changing target. But it is a really fascinating way to, I know from talking to people who've left these groups, that's one of the ways is they give them a sense of history. They give them that myth, essentially. And
they also give them a sense of power and control.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And when we find ourselves in a social position where we're lacking economic, social, or political power, we grasp onto whatever avenue we can, whether that's masculinity, whether that's whiteness, right? In the case of sort of economically marginalized white folks that really zoom into whiteness as their avenue of badassery, of domination, of power, like that's what they have.
Is that what? So to sweep it back into the question about heathen, about how the stories, how these stories we tell ourselves in the heathen community, how is this reflective of how heathens see themselves in American society with all of these different forces going on? And have you seen the sort of narratives and stories start to change, either character or flavor, or is it variations on a theme as to how we're defining ourselves, or how we have defined ourselves previously in this crazy world that we live in?
Well, I think that narrative in particular, again, it lends a sort of credibility and kind of a historical longevity, if you will, right? Like if you are part of a historically situated, long existing peoplehood with moral credibility, right? Then all of a sudden you're not just a weird marginalized new religious movement that just got made up in the 70s, right? But you're like, right, you're part of some deeply rooted epic story. And you know, we're all nerds, right? So like we watch the Vikings and all those shows, and being part of that and feeling like that's our cultural heritage, like is really deeply meaningful to a lot of people. Right. So those stories are really appealing because it's this thread of continuity that anchors you in time to a peoplehood that's yours, a sense of belonging. You know, that's really powerful.
And I also have to note some of the imagery that we have associated with in the media that we have associated with this Norse pagan Viking thing. It's usually like some variation of like Conan the Barbarian, right?
Yeah.
More Conan than it, and I don't think that's unintentional, right? I think some of the original, Lauren, you probably know more about this than I do. Some of the progenitors of the faith in the 70s were really into Conan.
Oh yeah, McNallen was super into Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah, so it's probably not. It's not surprising that these kinds of motifs would make it in here, but this idea of the strong, white warlord covered in cool tattoos, one of which is definitely a chin stripe. It's not actually a chin stripe, but yeah, and piercings and everything. Yeah. And he's so cool, and he listens to nothing but Amon Amarth.
And I mean, we have to historically contextualize McNallen, though, right? Like he started this, back in the 70s, but it was also like, again, past the civil rights triumphs just happening, fresh off the press. So it was in that way a kind of backlash to the front lash of that movement in terms of like, let's reassert and find our the roots of our cultural heritage so we can also be a racialized people. Right. And then
I would disagree with you on McNallen.
But it was also, I was going to say it was also a response to feminism.
I would say Christensen is more that than McNallen.
Well, he was an ex-soldier, right? And he was kind of
right, but he didn't really make that switch until he was influenced by Christensen.
Yes,
he was pretty much just what he started at first was basically just a Viking fan club.
Yeah, like going in the woods,
fan club for people who liked Vikings. Right. Yeah, but it was just a fan club for people who were into Vikings.
Well,
then Christensen radicalized him.
Yeah. Well, you can also see.
Sorry, this is my area of expertise.
But there's a string here. There's a string here that we can tie up, which is basically this idea that when one feels threatened, when one feels like they're under attack, they might, as a way of, anchoring themselves and in some form of self-comfort, maybe. And maybe this is me psychoanalyzing it. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. Don't think that I am. But to cling to symbols of strength and power and identity that you want to now represent, basically almost as a shield for yourself, to say like, no, I feel like I'm under attack. I need these symbols to cling to feel strong, to feel like I'm in control again. Vikings, Conan, any number of these kind of things, not necessarily overtly thinking like, I need these as symbols to reassert my whiteness, but to feel that sense of power and like that there's this power and strength that I can tap into through these kinds of symbols, regardless of whether or not they're historically accurate. It's more the power of the story itself, which I think is part of the point of why we wanted to pull sociologists in here, because a historian's going to tell us, well, that's all bunk. Nobody looked like that, back in the day. Nobody was doing that.
And I'm not even arguing that McNallen was self-conscious of the whiteness component so much as a sort of ethnic peoplehood that sort of sacralized and spiritualized this sort of men's movement that he was kind of doing, right? That in part of that sort of mythopoetic men's movement. But then later he was like, oh, right, now the whiteness is salient and we're doing this racial thing. But it was still this sort of spiritual kind of people like ethnic something, right? Later
his Texas was showing.
But it was like anger and feeling without a direction until it was given direction by someone who actually did have the political ideology to furnish upon the collection of symbols and emotions, and to hone that into the movement that they would eventually go on to found together.
And Christensen was an interesting part of this, because I believe Christensen consciously harnessed this stuff. Christensen was never super religious. She was someone who, because I know, for instance, in the documentation of her Odinist groups in the Florida prisons, you see where a majority, they never had bloat, they never had symbol, they never had rituals, they never had prayers. It was all political talk. If you go in and read the Odinist, her journal that she put out, I guess until she went to prison. She put that out until she went to prison for drug trafficking. There's almost no religious content. It is all political. My favorite episode, of course, being about how Star Trek is the epitome of telling the white man's story or some stuff like that.
It was Star Wars.
There's a whole or Star Wars. Yeah, excuse me. Star Wars. There's a 5-page article about Star Wars and whiteness. It was terrifying. Yes, I have read
Empire stories that we like.
Yeah, I have read every issue of the Odinist and the Runestone, and I'm not okay. Just in case you guys were wondering, I'm not okay.
But this is part of the story that we're telling right now is part of constructing our history, right? And one of the questions that I had for Dr. Snook is how is it that this is actually the first question I had, but now I'm going to get to it. How is it that almost every question that I ask a heathen, this is something I say, every question I ask about history, I always feel like what we're doing is we're talking about the present. Whenever, we say what should I do about this? Well, ancient heathens did this. Well, ancient heathens did this. And I always feel like we're having conversations actually about the present moment. So how is it that when we construct our past, how is that affecting both our present? How does that potentially affect our future?
Yeah, I don't see a difference between heathens doing that and Christians interpreting the Bible in a way that sort of suits their contemporary political, ideological framework, right? So I feel like that's always going to happen because people exist in sort of an ideological framework, and then religion is just sort of mapped onto that to justify, legitimate, lend credibility. And so that's why, because they are. Right? They are talking about the present because honestly, what do we all really even know about the past? Again, every time a historian says well, this is what really happened, I'm like, I give up. I don't know what's true anymore, No, so we really are talking about the present, and every religious group is.
And this is something that is brought up a lot lately. I'm on TikTok like other people. And there's a big debate on what we call hashtag Norse talk. Bring it up. Is Loki worship is a big thing about this. So this is actually another story that bring it up. I want to bring it up with this. I want to know. Talk about this. So it's the constant debating as to whether or not Loki was historically worshipped, and that's what it's like. Is it historical? Is it this? And then you start seeing this construction of a Lokian community coming up and saying either looking for ways to read themselves into the history, or looking for ways to read themselves into the literature, and constructing an entire new identity out of this in a really interesting way. And it always, what you just said about what can we really know about the past, like if a historian came up and said, I just have to wonder, like if a historian found a dig or something, right? Found a dig, all of a sudden pulled up all this stuff, and oh look, there's all these Loki statues, and yes, he was worshipped all over the place. We just didn't dig in the right spots. Would the people who deny it completely change their minds on history just in light of this evidence, or do we think like it wouldn't happen? I don't know. Is the story more important than the history?
I mean, I guess what we'd have to know to answer that question is how important history and accurate history really is to people versus history just being used as sort of a legitimating framework for just doing what they want, right? So like my whole thing is, I mean, history schmistery, like, is it meaningful to you? Does it feel sacred? Like, do it, you know? Because why do you have to root it in the past in order for it to be real? I mean, I get it. All like world religions, they're really old. So we want to be really old, and we want to be based on actual sort of sacred or historical texts. So again, we feel the power of that continuity. So it feels a little bit less socially constructed. But, you know, is it a living, breathing faith, or is it in a book? I don't know. I prefer the former.
It's why I always say, to me, my heathenry is grounded in the present and informed by the past.
Yeah, and I mean, if
it's
right.
Yeah.
And if we learn that the past was other than we thought it was, does it change what we're doing now? If what we're doing now is meaningful and has built community, it should.
Sometimes.
Not
Because
so.
I'm an experimental heathen, right? So that means maybe sometimes I'm going to take that new information and say, hey, let's try it and see if it works.
Well, if there's cool new ritual forms, of course, who wouldn't want to do that? That's just.
But
cool.
I mean, anything I find out, I am a true Reconstructionist heathenry, not like a book beating Reconstructionist, but I use the Reconstructionist method to constantly try to improve what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if I'm presented with new information and I think there's a way that I can improve what I'm doing by using it, I'm absolutely going to try to see if it works. And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, well, that was fun. Let's try something else. Because I think that's the only way we're going to continue to have a living and growing religion. But and that is one of the things I know this may stray out a little bit, but in this vein, with that myth making and construction, what does it say about the racist groups that their ritual format, their theology, nothing has really changed since the late 70s? Whereas with your more inclusive groups, you do see a lot of people, a lot of change, a lot of theological challenges, a lot of people willing to do what I'm doing or experiment and try new things.
Yeah.
Because I know, for instance, I have copies of the AFA's rituals from the early 80s, and they're performing the exact same rituals today.
Yeah, it's just the difference between sort of conservative church and liberal churches that have like a pet worship service, where they bring their pets. Like, it's just like, innovation versus rootedness in the past that legitimates sort of your I don't know, righteousness, so to speak. Right.
I'm sorry. I gotta.
Thank you. Oh, Sarah, my man.
Sarah is one of our panelists, and I agree with you. That was pretty much like my experience with heathenry through the 2000s.
Well, and I appreciate what some of the Scandinavian and sort of European heathens are trying to do with Nordic animism, right? Again, it is innovative, it is living, it is and it's in many ways culturally rooted for them, but it's not beholden to any particular stories, right? Because the stories kind of grow and shift and change according to the people telling them, right? And they're cool with that, and they've done some really neat things.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm trying to do right now is trying to tie in America, trying to tie heathens to their folk culture, to their local culture, folk magic, because Nordic animism is wonderful, but we don't live there. We live here.
Yeah, we should
So
figure out what we do.
yeah, I'm very entrenched and very involved with Ozark folk practice and Ozark folk magic, and a group of pagans from across the sphere who are trying to find the thread of Anglo-Saxon that still exists, because this is a child culture of Anglo-Saxon magic. So we're trying to basically take this culture and then make it syncretic with heathenry. That's what I do. And I get a lot of negative feedback from that. But to me, for instance, I'm not trying to use exotic herbs. I'm using, I am literally I have a rule that for the most part, I only use things I can find within 5 or 10 miles of my house, with a few exceptions. And part of that is, I think, really important. I'm teaching a class on that at Tropes Mood. It's always that they don't understand the critique about animism. What I'm saying is Nordic animism can be done everywhere. Nordic animism is very focused sometimes on the creatures, the beings, the things that exist in the Nordic areas. I live in Arkansas in the Ozark Mountains.
Yeah.
It's not the same creatures.
Well, and I wasn't suggesting we should all do it.
So it's less. So
yeah, but no, I was trying to explain to a comment. We had a commenter who was a bit confused.
Okay, the
so what I'm saying
is cool.
Yeah, the scaffolding is cool. What I'm saying is that, like, digging into animism is digging in where you are locally, and understanding those spirits and stuff. So I was trying to explain to a viewer who had a question about that, because they didn't understand my point. So, but yeah, it's Nordic animism is great, but I'm not Nordic. I'm American, and that's the other thing. Like, I think that is a critique we get a lot from Nordic people, is how a lot of American, especially heathens, want to cosplay Viking.
Yep. Again, there's a reason, right, that we've unveiled here. But I mean, I wouldn't even begin to know how to do, like, I'm in Iowa. I'm in rural Iowa. Like, what the hell? I don't know.
Worship the corn gods?
Corn gods. There's plenty of it.
I also find it a little funny that the Scandinavians that they try and cosplay as are not like current Scandinavians. You don't have people going around going, let's all have healthcare and be really good environmentalists. And
I love that.
Let's all shop at IKEA and H&M. But no one does that. It's always the greaves and the helmets and whatever. Which
you want their ancient culture, not their modern political system.
Yeah, we don't need their economics. We want the imagination, not the current reality.
Not the maternity leave.
Right.
Not the universal child care. We don't want that.
That's right. We don't want any of that cool. We don't want the good stuff. We just want
their stories. Yeah. Their continuity, their rootedness, their cultural rootedness.
Yes. And that's also, I think that there's speaking of the cultural rootedness, about getting to the purpose of that history. Like, even if, and I wrote this on the Troth website, it's up there somewhere, where even if you were to discover, like, to the letter what someone in 756, and I keep changing the date, 756 CE, in Sweden believed, like, if you were to able to pin that down to the letter, the only thing you would have discovered is what they believe. You would not have discovered anything about what you believe, right? You've not discovered that part yet. That part still has to be negotiated with the world around us, with the different stories, with everything. We can't simply say, oh, we discovered a journal, the diary of Sven, who just wrote everything about all the beliefs that they had in pagan times. It still doesn't tell us what we believe. It just tells us what Sven believe
in a very particular cultural moment and an economic political environment that is not ours, where what Sven believed would have probably been really freaking weird.
I always love to tell people, ask me, well, did the ancient heathens believe this? And I would go, yes, but no, but also yes, but maybe, because it's thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, and we don't know. we can
And
make our
a
best
scholar
guess.
will tell you yes, and then tomorrow another one will say actually no.
Yeah.
That's why I always say yes,
Yeah.
but no, but also yes, but maybe, because the answer is we don't know. And I really enjoy that. But I think that is really important. You know, I do think we all need that origin. We need that feeling of belonging. And when we're not provided that, we do make it up.
Yeah. But
So
that
what-
doesn't make it any less
Yeah.
legit, right? Which is
Right.
one thing that I think people need to come to terms with, is that we socially
Yes.
construct so many things that have consequences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why not?
I guess to me, the
Money's
only
not
thing
real.
the only thing that bothers me is when people want to try to pass off things as factual
Yeah, that's annoying.
rather than, and only because I feel like sometimes people then try to use that to hurt people. That's when those collective myths bother me.
Mhm.
And I say that as someone who came from the upbringing of being taught about the Mark of Cain and all that kind of stuff, which are also cultural myths that are developed in other groups. You know, the idea of the Mark of Cain on it in the Baptist perspective really didn't happen until the whole Baptist takeover by the far right in the 70s. Melissa has a question here. It's split into two, so I'm just going to read it. Can DNA help with cultural belonging? And I'm going to say no.
No, it can just tell you
Because
what
we've,
geographical area your ancestors came from, and that doesn't really
I'll
get
say this
rooted in
too, like,
culture.
if it could, we wouldn't be having discussions like this. Like, if DNA could do all these things, there'd be no need to have discussions like this.
I literally went to a talk today, and molecular biologists said no.
No, but there would be no reason to have talks like this, because if it were embedded in our DNA, the cultural belonging thing, it would just happen. There'd be no discussions over what culture do we belong to, because it would simply be like having a finger or a fingernail. Like, it would just be there.
The God gene.
Right.
None of us would have the same. None of us would have different religions from our parents.
Right. We couldn't do that. It would just simply manifest, just like our hair does, just like my weird fingers manifest. Like, that's how our religion would then manifest. But it doesn't. So
if you want to read like in-depth research on this, in fact, we need to get Ben on. We need to get the other Ben on.
There you
Dr.
go.
Ben Wagner.
I'm the wrong Ben. I'm the wrong Ben for this.
We need to get the biology.
Question, Lauren?
No, that was it. Was her, she wrote it in a way that was split into two messages, so I couldn't put it on the screen.
Okay.
Dr. Ben Wagner, who is a biologist and presented a paper at Cherry Hill on metagenetics, the idea that the God gene essentially, and basically the answer is no, but also no. So, wonderful paper he wrote. Now, epigenetics is we talked about this, I think 2 weeks ago. The idea that your genetic expression can be affected by your environment is a thing.
Right.
But yeah, your culture is definitely created by your social environment and your choices. And I think that that's an important thing to remember. And that's also why I often say, even if you're heathen, if you live in America, you're still Christian.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention something today.
Because you live in an overwhelmingly Christian environment. So you're constantly influenced by Christian ideas and all that kind of stuff.
That's true. I did want to ask Dr. Smith, though, just about, since since you're on a religious show now and you're a member of the Troth, and you can comment on, you can speculate on this kind of stuff, but like,
oh boy,
where do we get to go? So just maybe taking, you can keep the scholar hat on, keep the doctor hat on if you want to, but I also wanted to ask in more probing terms, like, where can we go from here? Like, what are the different paths you kind of see available, just to zooming out, like, for the development of heathenry in America and the world over? What paths are available today that maybe weren't available yesterday or in the past? And like, how do we choose to how do we be better? How do we get, because I read your book in 2015 it was published.
That's when it was published. Yeah.
Yeah, I read the book back in 2015, and I wanted to know, like, reflecting on that, where have we come since then? Are we in a better place than we were then? Are we in a worse place? And if we are in a worse place, how do we get in a better place?
You know, sometimes I think of that book and I think like, man, it was really dated. It was a product of sort of that political cultural moment. But then other times I think like, wow, that was really, there was some foresight in there. Like that was
really prescient. Yeah.
You know, some people told me that it sounded mean spirited, but that's because at the time it was like really sort of critical. And I mean that in critical theory kind of way, right? Like it was really calling out all of these different structures of sort of inequity and in our community. And now that's all the rage, right? And so I think back to it and I think, you know, like I think some of the like examples that I tell would be different now, but the meaning behind them would not have changed. I don't know. I think one of the things is that the dynamics of heathen communities have changed. Like there were a lot more sort of regional and sort of closer knit kindreds that were together, like the regional lightning across the plains, those whole big events that, you know, had lots of sort of cultural weight and then fell apart. Right. So I think that
maybe people shouldn't rob their mothers and go to, you know,
well, that's, yeah, right. Also agree. Yeah. But my point is that like so much has changed in terms of the structural dynamics of like where heathens are and how they group and how they worship. And, you know, the influence of social media and TikTok and all, and sort of our political climate in the world's on fire. So it's like, we're in a different place now. I don't have an answer to your question. Like, where do we go from here? Do you have any ideas? You tell me.
Oh, but you're the doctor.
Yeah, I'm not the kind of, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I mean, all I can say is that like conservative churches are gaining steam. They're also, I mean, the church in general is falling apart, right, across the board, but conservative churches have an uptick because they have that narrative continuity, because they have that rooted in sort of systems that sort of the framework of legitimating narratives, right? And at this point, kind of cultural hegemony to a certain degree. And they have that victimhood narrative and they have all of those things. And they have physical churches that people will go to, and liberals are allergic. And so that's why we can't have nice things, right? Because we don't want to go to a place, we don't need a physical space, we don't want to sort of squat anywhere, and you know, I don't know. It's when I teach sociology religion, we do talk a lot about, you know, there's sort of the cultural power of the church in people's lives, and the sort of the feeling of certainty that offers people, that we just sort of by nature of our political worldviews do not claim. So it's hard to use it as a tool to mobilize us.
There's also a phenomenon of people, adults returning to the faith of their childhood in times of crisis that's been studied pretty, especially people who have left I know the studies that I've read about it have been specifically about the LDS church, but there are other examples of people returning to Catholicism or going into a more conservative version of what they believed, as a way during a time of personal crisis. So for instance, your wife is diagnosed with cancer, or you're diagnosed with some sort of health condition, and you will return back to that childhood faith because it's a comfort. And I do
it
think
offers you certainty.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing with that must be awesome. Religion and that's the thing with a religion that is essentially very DIY. We don't always have that certainty. We don't have salvation narratives. We don't have proselytation. You know, I am not going out ringing doorbells for Odin. I've only done it once, and to be fair, it was another heathen, so it doesn't count.
Well, I also I think that in a sense, so you put the challenge back on me, and I'm totally I had to think about it for a second. But and thank you for doing that. I think that yes, ultimately you're right that a lot of these conservative churches are gaining a lot of steam because they present certainties in a world that feels very uncertain. In a way, present sanctuary for people in a world that's uncertain. They find sanctuary in these certainties, and I think a way to answer that, if I'm going to solve the problems of the world, is answering back with not necessarily certainty, but solidarity, in a way of saying, like, in declare there's solidarity in a group declaring a set of values and saying, we care about this, we care about this, we care about this, and then people reflecting that and saying, hey, I care about that too. I am so glad that there's this institution that cares about the things I care about. That's great. I've seen that too. Not necessarily just providing certainties, but providing ways that people can feel that kind of solidarity and togetherness and belonging in declared value. So if we say something like, heathens believe in hospitality, and then we start demonstrating that hospitality through, we say homeless outreach, for example, doing soup kitchens, petitioning, getting together with other people in interfaith contexts and petitioning your city council to actually build shelters or to not bulldoze shelters that people have built. Those are important things that we can do to demonstrate that and to have that solidarity where it's not necessarily certainty, but it does offer that sense of sanctuary where people can say, I feel at home and I feel more grounded in these values that I care about. Anyway, that's my spiel.
And I do think that I don't think for heathenry, I think we kind of almost have to go in the opposite direction sometimes. Especially with the Tropes, my philosophy has been, until we create an environment where everyone feels at home, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, whatever, then we're not going to be a true community. And so I think that that's, for us on our side, maybe the thought then is we'll construct these narratives of, because like here's a constructed narrative that I've seen that I'm agnostic on, but for instance, they will find a warrior grave that will appear to be female bodied, and you will see a plethora of people who will say, oh, this is awesome, this is a woman warrior, but you'll also people who are putting in that narrative and say, oh, well, this must have been a trans person. And the fact of the matter is we don't know. But for people who are trans, that's incredibly important to them. That's incredibly important to see themselves in history, to see themselves in, their religious past. For me, as a woman I'm like a woman if you bought them on Wish or Alibaba. Seeing a woman who defies gender stereotypes is important to me. So I create that myth in my brain of, this is a woman who was defying gender stereotypes, because that's who I am. I work in a male-dominated field. That's what I am. So I can see where taking things that are factual and then adding our own myth on top of it can be very important to our own feeling of, I have space at this table.
Representation can be a really powerful legitimating force. So absolutely, it's important.
Yeah, and Weird Web Radio. Man, I did not realize that was such a tongue twister. Try and say that 10 times fast. I've seen pagans of all types gather at different public rituals. One thing they crave beyond anything is the physical company of other pagans. To know you're not alone, right? to practice a minority religion, let's say we'll say small religion, is to feel alone a lot of the time, if you're not with a lot of other people. And yeah, it really makes people feel a lot better to see others. Yeah.
And even if you can't, it's a physical, one of the reasons we've been doing the streaming rituals here, one of the reasons we do, if you're a Tropes member and we have member moot where we all get together on Zoom and just hang out, we have drinks and divination, we have our devotional groups, is because people crave other people. If we learned nothing else during the panorama, it's, yes, I don't say that word because YouTube will penalize you for saying it. If we learned nothing during that time, I love watching Ben finally get it.
No, it took me a couple seconds after Ben.
It's just the expression on Ben's face when he finally got it was the best part. Yeah, as in the 19 kinds of
yes, we're with you.
Yeah, I was just explaining for the listeners who might not get that yet.
No, I got it.
Yeah, all right. So is that it really kind of changed how we gather, and I think it also changed heathen groups. I know it changed my kindred significantly. It changed gatherings. It changed how we do symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say here, that is I kind of want to get your sociological point on this, because this is a myth that has been created in heathen circles and spaces in regards to symbol, right?
Okay.
And it's been completely shattered and blown apart because of COVID. And people are finding no issue with it. It used to be you had to share a horn. Right? It's the well of weird. We all share the same
Take
horn.
the words and drink the thing. Yeah, got it.
Yeah. Now everyone's getting like individual drinking vessels because we don't want to die.
Germs. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're all suddenly thinking like adults all of a sudden. And people have found that there's no diminishment in ritual. There's no diminishment in the spiritual fulfillment of ritual. So I guess my question is, what happens to a community when that community myth gets challenged and dies?
Well, if there's a new one to come in and take its place, just sort of more, I think, more community sort of growth in that collective identity and sort of, community practice and like collective memory building, right? So I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
Like you change a thing that you thought was canon and now you have a new one and it's cool.
Yeah. And I think that was the cold sore ritual. Yeah, definitely.
Oh boy.
Why did it take this to make us do this?
It really is amazing that we survived.
Yeah. As I said on Heathen Talk a while back, we're in the late adolescence of our religious development.
We're just figuring out the basics here. Yeah.
Like most adolescents, it is a wonder that we're alive.
Yep.
But I do think that is, I think that is so that important. And I think that when we hear these mythologies, I do think sometimes it's important to challenge them, because it comes back to that old. Sorry, Lonnie. You're not
Weird
allowed to
web
post these
radio
things
is killing it tonight. Do you like that one? Weird web radio.
Oh man, you're not allowed to post these things. It's making me laugh too much.
Amazing.
So I guess the thing is it good to challenge these things, these mythologies in our communities?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's how growth happens, right? Is because when you abandon these old things, then new ones spring up in their place that you have collectively created that can be more meaningful. I mean, again, all these things have a social function, right? But they're not the only things that serve that function. Like other things could do that, right? If we just sort of collectively create meaning together. I mean, that's really all we're ever doing, right? We're just meaning makers.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people.
Yeah.
I have my moments sometimes.
You got one there. I am all out of questions for you. Have answered
Well,
you've answered it all.
yeah.
Scotty,
And
thank you so
I
much.
just really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. So, Ben, next week we're going to be continuing this myth series.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We are going to actually have on our military liaison, Josh Heath, to talk about the myth of the warrior religion.
Ooh.
Josh himself is a veteran,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to talk about the different ways that this religion has appealed to, and specifically narratives have been constructed to appeal to military personnel, veterans, and how some of that just might not be 100% true, and how we can construct maybe new narratives to appeal to that particular audience. So it's stuff
that
that's
better
right up,
serve, not even appeal, that better serve them.
yeah, and that better serves them.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be, Josh is so great. For those of you who aren't familiar, he was the one he and his wife founded the Open Halls Project. And Josh and his wife are responsible for us having Heathen available in the military, as far as like be able to put that on your records, as far as there being a briefing in the chaplain's guide on Heathenry. That's all him and his wife. So we're very lucky to have him on next week. So really excited on that. Super enjoying these. And once again, Scotty, so grateful you got to come on with us tonight and share.
Yeah, super fun.
And next week we will have that. And getting close to Yule, don't forget we will have another live stream Yule ritual. And for Yule Eve on that Friday night, we are not going to have a live show, but what we will have is a collection of our various panelists reading for you and your children Yule stories that night. Ben, you look up. You look, yeah. You look a little
I love reading stories. My daughter's gonna love it. She always has to read her stories. So
it's gonna be awesome. We're gonna be, and that'll be something you can share with your kids. So just thought I would, something fun, family friendly. So, well, you guys, everyone, take care, and we will be back next week, same time, same place. Have a good one.
Good night.